In 1981, a 15-year-old boy walked onto the train platform at 34th Street Penn Station. He was really excited because he was going to try something that he had never tried before, even though it was obvious that this was something he was clearly not allowed to do. A few moments later, the E-train pulled into the station and the boy got onto the train. And if he had never gotten on that train, his life story might have had a happy ending. But that's not what happened. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of my New York City stories. And let's get into this one. Darius McCollum was born in 1965 to Elizabeth and Samuel McCollum. He was an only child. When he was an infant, his mom liked to take him on the subways to calm him down when he was acting up, similar to how a lot of parents will take their child on a car ride. I would guess that most people probably wouldn't consider the subway to be a peaceful place in New York, but Darius loved the subway. Growing up, he couldn't get enough of it. He'd run up and down the train car, and he'd be looking out the windows and getting a good look at the tracks. He would look at the subway map when he first learned how to read, and he quickly memorized the entire thing. He could tell you which trains stopped at which stations, what was a local train versus what was an express train, which lines were elevated, where there were free transfers. He had a true knowledge of each and every stop. He had relatives calling the house at all hours of the day, asking him how to get to different places in New York by train, and he could tell them. He also had a great relationship with his mom. His dad worked 6 days and spent Sundays watching sports, so it was Mom that would take him shopping and help him with his homework, and he really liked school. But eventually, school took a turn for Darius. Even though he enjoyed learning, he got bullied for being a little bit of a nerd. Classmates would try to pass their homework off on him and steal his lunch, and this had a big impact on him. He didn't feel comfortable around his classmates all the time. So the one place he truly felt accepted was on the trains. The workers who regularly came through Darius's stations knew exactly who he was. He'd get high fives from the conductors, they would take him into their little room so he could push the buttons to open the doors at the stops, and they even let him make announcements. He was like a local celebrity in the subways from a pretty young age. Then, when Darius was 12 years old, there was this big snowstorm, but that wasn't going to keep him from going to school. However, it seemed like not many other people felt the same way. Only he and one other student showed up that day. The teacher gave each of them a separate puzzle to work on while she straightened up some shelves in the classroom, and she had left a pair of scissors on her desk unattended. Darius's classmate got up from his seat, and he got those scissors. Darius was distracted by his puzzle, kind of hunched over at his desk, but the next thing he knew, there was this sharp pain in his back. The other boy had stabbed him. The teacher screamed for help, and they were able to get the scissors away from the boy, but Darius was losing blood. He was rushed to the hospital after passing out on the floor, and it took him 2 weeks in the hospital to recover. He had a punctured lung, and the scissors barely missed his heart. He almost died right then and there. From that point on, Darius had a real hatred for school. He didn't trust anyone his age. He'd pull the fire alarm just to get out of school, or sometimes he wouldn't go at all. He would disappear for hours, and he'd have his mother just so worried. Eventually, his parents had him committed to Elmhurst Hospital Center for Psychiatric Evaluation due to his depression and history of running away. They were hoping the hospital would be able to do something for him, but he stayed for 9 months with no improvements. In fact, he seemed to be getting worse, likely because he was being given Thorazine, a drug that was not safe for children. It had all sorts of terrible side effects. Even after coming home, he'd continued to run off, and of course the one place he felt safest was in the subways. That was his safe place, his happy place. Now, of course, if you were an employee of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, or MTA, and you saw a child hanging around unsupervised, you might be a little concerned. But Darius was an exceptional liar and just told anyone who asked that he was a family member of an employee, so they never batted an eye at him. In fact, the employees loved him. He'd volunteer to help them in any way that he could, whether it was sweeping or getting them snacks from a vending machine, whatever to make the time pass by. When Darius's mom found out what he was doing, she would go to the rail yard and plead with workers to send him back to school. But they'd all grown so attached to him that they never did. They even gave him gifts on his birthday and Christmas, things associated with the MTA like uniforms, keys, flashlights, hard hats. He acquired so much knowledge from just being around all the time, and because he had been gifted a uniform, he felt like he was part of the team. Employees would actually call him up at like 5 in the morning and say, "Hey, You want to come in and help me out for the day?" And this inclusion did wonders for his self-esteem. Nobody else had ever really treated him like this. In April 1978, so Darius was 13 years old at the time, he got quite the surprise. He went to hang out with MTA workers for the day, and an employee asked him if he wanted to learn how to actually operate a train. He'd supervise him, but show him what buttons to press and levers to pull. He was going to let him release and pump the brakes, use the throttle. Darius was so excited to be given this opportunity. And during this lesson, he got to showcase all of this knowledge that he had picked up from being around everyone at the time. He got this big rush from being in control of the train and feeling it move. And he was a natural at it. He looked like a future employee in the making. When that ride was over, all he could do was wait for the next opportunity. And that opportunity came the very next day. And the day after that. And the day after that. Darius was operating subway trains on nearly a daily basis at the age of 13. On January 29, 1981, a man named Carl Sherlach, who was a motorman for the New York City E-Train, he changed Darius's life completely. Carl's girlfriend worked as a railroad clerk at the 34th Street Penn Station stop. Because of the way their schedules lined up, seeing each other wasn't always the easiest thing to do, so Carl came up with a plan. He contacted Darius and asked him this question: "How would you like to operate the train by yourself?" Carl wanted to actually get off the train at 34th Street so he could run upstairs to see his girlfriend. Darius had been learning how to operate the trains nearly every day for the last 2 years, so Carl figured that Darius was more than capable of this task. He was just looking to take an unscheduled break during his shift. Darius saw this as an amazing opportunity and said, sure, why not? And so he got dressed in his MTA uniform and he put on his cap. He made his way down the stairs at 34th Street Penn Station and waited for Carl's E-Train to pull up to the platform. Darius couldn't help but think of how awesome this was going to be. His first time operating a train by himself. It didn't even seem real. But a few moments later, Carl's E-Train pulled up. The doors opened. Darius got onto the train and he crossed paths with Carl. And Carl told him, hey, thanks for doing this. So what you're going to do is you're going to take the train to the next 6 stops. The last stop is the World Trade Center. From there, you do the reset, make your way back up here. And make sure to pick me up again at this station. That's it. Darius acknowledged that he understood. And just like that, Carl stepped off of the train, and these hundreds of passengers were now going to be transported unknowingly by a 15-year-old boy who was not employed by the MTA. Darius made his announcement that the next station was 23rd Street and to stand clear of the closing doors. The doors closed, and they were off. Now, Darius knew exactly what he was doing. He followed every rule in the book as if he had written it himself. He let passengers off the train at 23rd Street, more passengers got on, and rinse and repeat. Next station was 14th Street, and then West 4th Street. Everything was going perfectly, but that all changed when he pulled into Chambers Street. At Chambers Street, there was this woman who noticed that Darius was driving the train, and she alerted an MTA employee on the platform. That employee took a look in the window and was very confused. He gave Darius the signal to stay put, and then he approached his window. At the window, he asked him, where's the train operator? And Darius simply responded, I'm the train operator. The employee looked at him like he was crazy. In what world would a teenager be in charge of a subway train? He told him to stay put for a moment, and then he walked away. Now, in Darius's mind, he wasn't doing anything wrong. In fact, he was upset that they had fallen behind schedule. Now, he wasn't stupid. He knew exactly what was happening. But still, he figured if he did everything exactly the right way, maybe they'd allow him to proceed. Instead, the employee came back and said that they were taking the train out of service. Darius was upset, but he got on the PA and told all the passengers that the train was no longer in service and everyone had to get off of the train. He then made sure that people were in fact getting off the train before getting off of the train by himself. And that's when he was met by the transit police. They asked him where the train operator was, and Darius gave them a straightforward answer. He didn't know. And that's when they put him in handcuffs and detained him. The news channels had a field day with this. They were saying things like Darius had hijacked the train and he had taken it on a joyride. Articles were printed up for the papers, and from the looks of some of those articles, Darius never ratted out Carl until much later in life. The articles said that the operator fell ill, although this could have easily just been the MTA not wanting the real story to go public. Darius's mother blamed herself for ever taking him onto the trains in the first place. She forbade him from mentioning trains in the house and wouldn't let him leave the house. But Darius was still drawn to those trains and knew in his heart that the subway was where he wanted to be. And so he would sneak out and would go back to the subways anyway. He'd go back again And again, it got to the point where his mom got so tired of worrying about him that she put her faith in God that he would protect her boy. Over the next year, Darius had his growth spurt and was tall enough to now reach the pedals and see over the steering wheel of a New York City MTA bus. He would go to the yard in uniform and just pick up a bus. The buses didn't require keys unless you were trying to adjust the wheelchair ramp, so he would just walk into the yard. Nobody would stop him because they assumed he worked there. He was in uniform, and he would just take a bus. Now, he'd follow the routes to perfection and became an unofficial bus operator on top of an unofficial train operator. Was what he was doing legal? Absolutely not. But he wasn't doing this because he wanted to be a criminal. He was doing this because he wanted to be an MTA employee, and they had kind of shunned him in a way after his original detainment. When Darius turned 17, he applied to work for the MTA, but he was rejected. He tried again when he was 18, and again, he was rejected. The thought process on the MTA side was that they couldn't hire this man who was known for stealing one of their vehicles. That being said, his joyride was rated one of the highest among all employees in terms of protocols followed and safety and whatever other metrics they used. They just didn't want to be involved with him, period. And what they did was they started putting up his picture in all of the break rooms and workspaces, informing employees to report him if seen. Nowhere could you find wanted posters for subway shooters or assailants or hardened criminals. It was Darius's picture all over. And that did not stop him. He continued to find ways of sneaking into these spaces and getting into the subway. He worked unattended booths, he swept the platforms, and at one point he had 139 keys, including the one for the wheelchair ramp on the bus. It wasn't until 1989 that Darius was diagnosed with Asperger syndrome, which is a condition that today has been merged with other conditions into autism spectrum disorder. And even though he was not an employee of the MTA, over the next 30 years, he would drive more than 500 trains and buses. He would get arrested over and over again, but never for a crime of violence. In fact, he's never injured anyone. He was one of the strangest criminals New York had ever had. The rules had to apply to him, but at the same time, laws weren't designed to punish someone for doing what he was doing. He was just trying to do what he loved doing. But he was a felon, and as a felon, he struggled to find work, was often homeless. And when he was at his lowest, he'd find himself stealing another vehicle and repeating the cycle and getting arrested again. For one of these arrests, we can go to the year 1997. Now, he somehow got a hold of a superintendent's badge and made up a fake ID for himself, and a few nights in a row would go out to the yard and inspect trains. He would point out all of these things that were wrong and give suggestions to people on how to fix the discrepancies. He called himself Darius Manning. It wasn't until he had done it 3 times that people realized Superintendent Manning was Darius McCollum. That got him another 18 months for grand larceny, criminal impersonation, possession of stolen property, and trespassing. In 2000, Darius was trying to find a place to warm up, so he took his keys and opened up a control tower. While he was in there, a train at 57th Street tripped its emergency brake. So Darius sprang into action, grabbed a walkie, a vest, and he made his way down to inspect what happened. Nobody had any answers. He helped usher passengers off of the train, and it wasn't before long that the police showed up. Now, the police don't show up for a train tripping its emergency brake. The train operator actually recognized Darius from one of those wanted posters that were all over and alerted them. Darius was then taken and interviewed by the police, and they concluded that Darius was actually the one who tripped the brake from the control tower. Darius told them, "That's impossible. I don't have the proper key to do that. That requires a key." He cooperated with them wholly, but he was charged with reckless endangerment anyway. The sentencing came a year later, and Darius's mom was in the courtroom while court was presided over by a judge named Carol Berkman. The judge heard that Darius had Asperger's and decided to educate herself on the disorder via the internet. Based on what she read, she alone, without any sort of psychiatric degree, determined that Darius's behavior was inconsistent with the disorder, and that he was doing these things of his own free will. So she sentenced Darius to 5 years in prison, which was his harshest punishment to date. In the aftermath of September 11th, Darius was incarcerated at this point. The FBI consulted with him to make the subway system safe. They had done things like this with criminals like Frank Abagnale, who was famously portrayed by Leonardo DiCaprio in the film Catch Me If You Can. Darius had volunteered his knowledge to alert these federal agents of locations that intruders could sneak through without detection. He was led through the tunnels in shackles from his prison cell at Rikers Island. And instead of being rewarded for this knowledge, the Department of Corrections was told that Darius could be easily manipulated and terrorists could easily gain knowledge from him. And because of that, he was placed into solitary confinement. After his sentence was up in 2005, the MTA workers went on strike. Darius joined the picket lines. People wanted better pay and benefits, and even though Darius wasn't part of this union, he fought right alongside them. He marched across the Brooklyn Bridge with them, he rode the trains with them. He and 9 actual employees of the MTA were arrested for pulling a false alarm on a train in attempts to slow it down. He did another 20 days in jail for that. But he fought so hard for the union that there were people willing to vote for him to be a union representative, even though he wasn't an employee of the MTA. Now, throughout his time in prison, he maintained a relationship with his mother, constantly writing letters back and forth. But throughout the years, his mom lost faith that Darius was ever going to pull himself together and stop stealing trains and buses. She still loved him, but it was so heartbreaking seeing her son go through this over and over again. And she couldn't do anything about it because she was older and had retired to North Carolina at this point. Sadly, a lot of the time that Darius spent in prison was just awaiting trial without having been charged for anything. A lot of this is to blame on his lawyer, who failed to appear for his court dates. And when he attempted to fire that lawyer, the courts ruled that someone of his mental capacity wasn't able to make a decision like that. He wasn't able to switch lawyers until the man representing him was indicted for his own fraud crimes. In 2013, he was released again from yet another prison sentence, but this time on parole. Because of the parole mandate, he had to go back to New York City, not to his mother and father, who had retired to North Carolina. His mother was too weak to travel, and his father suffered from dementia, so in other words, they were staying put. Staying in New York City was a major problem for him just because of how easy it was to be around these trains and buses all the time. But he still wanted to be part of that world despite all of the trouble that it caused him. So something he did was he attempted to find volunteer work at the New York Transit Museum. This was like being in the subway without actually being in the subway. And he could show people how things worked down there, just like he had been taught firsthand when he was a teenager. This seemed like the perfect place for him. But when an anonymous person found out that he was doing this, the museum received phone calls telling them that they did not want him on the property. The museum itself is a self-supporting division of the MTA. It hadn't even been a week after his release that parole ordered him to wear an ankle bracelet to keep him from riding the subway. They figured if he knew he was being monitored, he might be less tempted to go on the trains. So he tried riding a bike from point A to point B, but he didn't really like it. The ankle monitor plan worked for about 48 hours. He removed the bracelet because he felt no joy anywhere else but the trains. And after he was caught, he was sent back to jail for yet another year. In 2015, he was released from prison with 0 parole restrictions. That means he'd be able to commute on trains again. But he was told, if he were to break the law again, it would come with a mandatory sentence of anywhere from 15 years to life in prison. But because of that ability to travel again, he was able to go and see his mom in North Carolina, which was super important to him. He spent some time with her out there in a much more laid-back lifestyle. They were able to embrace one more time, and he was able to sit out on the porch. No noise, no car horns, no subway. And I wish I could say that's the end of the story, but 3 months later, Darius returned to New York City. He had run out of money, didn't want to tell his lawyer about it, and was about to be homeless. And that's when he decided to take a Greyhound bus for yet another ride. He was caught and arrested again. He stood before a judge in October 2018, and the judge ruled that Darius was dangerously mentally ill. He was assigned on Track 1, the most dangerous assignment available, even though this was against state psychiatric recommendations, who put him on Track 3 or 2 at worst. The judge argued that he had been chasing the high that he received from publicity when he was first written about in the papers when he was 15 years old. So this made the judge believe that he was a narcissist. He is currently locked away in the Rochester Forensic Psychiatric Hospital, a prison facility for the criminally insane, the most dangerous inmates. He is scheduled to have regular retention hearings to determine if he is still dangerously mentally ill. The problem is that many believe he has never been dangerous or mentally ill. It's just a disability that leads to fixations on certain topics, like trains. So that's going to do it, folks. Now, if after hearing today's story, you feel as if Darius is not a dangerous person, shouldn't have to go through what he's going through, you can sign a petition at freedariusnow.com. You can also write a letter in support of Darius at that same website. I also encourage you to watch the documentary film Off the Rail, where you can actually hear Darius speak about his experiences. It'll give you better clarity for how to feel about this story. I will link the documentary and the petition site in the description below. So thanks for tuning in today. If you got something out of today's video, please share it with your friends that you think would like to hear it. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment down below, and I'll see you all on the next one. Deuces, kids.